Thank you, everyone, for being here. Excuse my voice, I'm a little sick. I am Julie Zuckerman, author of the Book of Jeremiah, and welcome to the March Literary Modiin author event. I'm going to make my intro shorter because of my voice tonight. We've been going for almost 4 years, Literary Modiin. This is our 34th event. And tomorrow when I send around the recording, I'll send you a link to all the books we've heard about in this series. The format of today's event is that each author will be speaking for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions. We have a large attendance today, so everyone's on mute. And if you have any questions, you can put those in the chat box. And any technical difficulties, just send a private note to me in the chat. Okay, let me take a sip of my tea before I introduce our first author. Okay, or two authors, really. Harry Lenga, who tells his story in The Watchmaker, was born in 1919 to a Hasidic family in Poland. He and his brothers learned to fix watches from their father, a skill that saved their lives over and over again in the German concentration camps during World War II. All of the brothers survived. Scott Lenga is Harry's son. Scott interviewed his father on video for some 37 hours in the early 1990s. 15 years after Harry's death, Scott started compiling and editing this interview material. This project grew into an obsession and now a book that relates the extraordinary saga of the Lenga brothers. So, Scott, I'm going to spotlight you and take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Julie, and thank you everybody who's joining from near and far today. I really appreciate it. Of course, my father can't be here with us today. He, by the way, is this brother who's pictured on our book, The Watchmakers. But his presence will be here with us in this conversation. As it's well known, most Holocaust survivors found it very, very difficult to speak about their experiences in the Holocaust. My father's brothers were not able to tell their children how they grew up in a small town called Koźnitz in Poland before World War II, or what happened to them in the Shoah. And but my father, he was on the other side of the spectrum. The story goes that around 1960, close to 15 years after the war ended, he started to have terrible nightmares every night. And and one day, or my mother used to shake him awake in the middle of the night, saying, "Harry, you're a free man. You're here in the United States. The war is over." And one day, by chance, he ran into another Holocaust survivor, and they shared some stories about what had happened to them during the war. And he noticed that night he didn't have any nightmares. So he understood from that moment that speaking about his experiences was a kind of therapy for him. And he never stopped speaking about it. By the time I was 5 years old, I didn't know what a concentration camp was, but I knew that my father had a number on his arm from a place called Auschwitz. And I knew the stories of how he and his brothers, Milach and Moshe, had made a promise that they would stay together no matter what happened to them, and the kind of terrible risks that they took to stay together, and how they helped each other to survive. My father had a very tough childhood. His mother died in childbirth when he was just 4 years old. And he and his brothers had a tough relationship with their father. He was strict and impatient with them. It was a single dad living in poverty, and things were very tough for him. And it wasn't easy for him to raise 5 kids. And So they had a tough go of it. They fell into a cycle of poverty that they could never get out of. And there were times, when my grandfather, Michoel, he would, in contending with all the challenges in his life, he really cleaved to his Hasidic way of life, and there were times when the family had literally nothing to eat and no money to buy even a loaf of bread. And my grandfather would look poverty and tragedy in the face and give his last coins away to somebody who came into his store asking for charity. My grandfather Michoel thought that he was teaching his kids how to walk the true spiritual path, but it was really just too much for them. My father would sometimes run outside and cry silent tears. Um, but things were different at his watchmaking bench. He didn't force his sons to learn watchmaking. They had to come with their own initiative. But if they did so, he would teach them by example, with a kind of patience that didn't uh, exist in his other interactions with them. And so they took to the trade and learned it. And of course, they didn't know how valuable those watchmaking skills would be for them in the war. And moreover, it wasn't until my father was facing the brutality of the German onslaught in Poland that he understood that his father's religious discipline was kind of a survival training for them that helped my father and his brothers keep their balance in the most extreme situations, and even be able to help others when they had nothing themselves, and to take huge risks to do it. Um, so I grew up listening to these stories, and I always liked these stories as a kid. They were great adventure stories, and my father never told them to me in a way that traumatized me. They were always quite empowering because they were about him and his brothers and all the amazing things that they did together. Of course, in my teen years, I was trying to carve out a identity as an ordinary American kid, and the Holocaust just wasn't my thing. So I drifted away from at least asking my father to tell his stories, though he would tell them to me anyway. And when I was away in college, halfway on the other side of the country, my father went into retirement, and he started doing speaking to high school classes and college classes. And he did a set of interviews with the local Holocaust Center in St. Louis. And it was a response to the Holocaust denial movement that sprung up in the late 1970s. Well, I took a look at those interview transcripts, and as I was reading them, I found myself saying, why didn't the interviewer ask this? Why did she ask that? I wanted to get in the game. So a few years went by, but eventually I arranged to have my father fly out to San Francisco, where I was living at the time. I took a week off work, and we just spent every day, all day, doing interviews because I wanted to fill in the gaps of all these stories that I had heard growing up. I call them interviews, but in some ways it was more like a deposition, because I'm trained as a lawyer, and I really wanted to get as much detail from him as I could about everything that happened in those years. So as Julie mentioned I'd done some 37 hours of interviews with him. And a couple years went by. I got married, and my father got sick and passed away. And those interviews stayed in a cabinet for some 20 years. And many people ask me why I waited 20 years to start writing. And I guess for me, it was okay that those interviews stayed in a cabinet year after year because I knew all the stories. And I honestly thought that that would be enough to preserve my father's legacy. Um, and in the meantime, I had some kids, and these were the stories that I told them. These were the bedtime stories that I told them as they were growing up. And when they got to a certain age, one of my daughters, my daughter Orly, started threatening that if I didn't write this book, she would write it herself. And and she even wrote a an early version of the Watchmakers for a seventh grade English class. Uh, Combined with that, when they got to their teen years, I wanted my daughters to hear these stories directly from my father the way I heard them. And it was only then that I began to understand that the interviews were just there was just too much material to be accessible really to anyone but me. So I knew I had to do something. What I was going to do, I wasn't exactly sure. This was in 2015. I was in my um, uh, mid 50s. And so I decided to do an experiment. What would happen if I took the interview transcripts and turned the dialogue into a monologue? And the result was staggering. A new coherence emerged from all of this material that I just hadn't seen before. Um, and from then on, I was hooked, and I understood that my task, my project, was going to be to preserve my father's first person voice and to minimize my footprint as much as possible. I guess the footprint that I do have on the book is I'm the person that's asking the questions that my father's responding to in the book. And because I have curiosity and love for these stories, I was able to guide his memory to places that he would not otherwise have thought to share with a larger audience. It was important for him for me to understand what happened to him in the war, but it was also important for him to make me understand who he was as a person, and that created a certain intimacy in the interviews that I hope comes through in the book. So I would like to do a reading. Uh, so I'm gonna focus on the time that he was in Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, we were already more dead than alive. Nothing about our situation indicated that we had a chance of surviving. Our struggle and our resistance was simply to hope for a better tomorrow. We would say that a miracle could happen a minute from now. Everything could turn around in a day or a week or a month. So it was worth it to push yourself through one more day. We worked hard to keep hope in our minds and not to become Meshuggah. And the more you talked yourself into it, the more you believed in that hope. If a hungry person believes that he'll find something to eat later, he can last longer. If he thinks it's pointless and I won't survive, he dies faster. I saw it happen many times. Pessimism is a terrible sickness. You destroy yourself. You have to have optimism all the time. One cold, late January morning, Moishe woke up with a start. Where are my shoes? I don't have my shoes. We searched through everything. They were gone, stolen in the night. That was a tragedy. Without shoes, you had to walk barefoot on rocks and snow in the freezing cold. It didn't take long before your feet were bleeding and frozen. You fell down and couldn't walk. You were finished. They would give you a pair of wooden Holland shoes, but those hurt your feet worse than anything else and didn't protect your feet from the cold. At night, you tied your shoes together and slept holding a shoe in each hand, with the laces knotted together behind your back. You tried to hold them tightly so you would feel any little touch and wake up right away if someone tried to grab them. But in the middle of sleep, you could unintentionally let go and move your hands away. We were on the top bunk, so it was more difficult for someone to steal from us, but somehow it had happened. We were so angry at Moshe for not guarding his shoes. Stealing shoes was a terrible, dirty thing to do. We didn't know who had done it. Many things had been stolen from other people that same night. A lot of people found out about Moshe's situation right away. Some prisoners in the barrack always had shoes to sell. I don't know how. Maybe they worked in a place where shoes from dead people were sorted. Maybe they stole shoes and bought stolen shoes from somebody else. One guy came to ask Moshe his shoe size and returned with a pair that fit him perfectly. That was mazel, I'm telling you. We had only a half hour from the time we woke up to go to the washroom, get our coffee, buy the shoes, and line up outside for the roll call. The bargaining was not a big to-do. The guy saw 3 brothers, so he asked for 3 rations of bread. We told him, we cannot all 3 of us die. We will give you 2 rations, and 1 ration will divide between ourselves. He agreed. He was under pressure too. If he walked out to the roll call with an extra pair of shoes, he would be shot. If he left the shoes in the barracks, somebody else would steal them. We didn't have any bread in the morning, so payment for the shoes would have to wait until we got our evening rations. Everybody bought on credit like this. You had to. But if you didn't pay what you promised, you could be stabbed by the other prisoner in your sleep, and they would find you dead in the morning. Even if your creditor didn't take revenge, everybody in the barrack would know that you tried to cheat him, and you wouldn't be able to get credit the next time. We avoided that kind of danger. In the evening, we gave the guy 2 rations of bread as promised, and divided the 3rd ration between ourselves. It was a big sacrifice, but we made sure Moshe got shoes. If we hadn't been together with him, and he had been alone in that situation, it would have been a dangerous thing for him to promise 2 rations of bread. If he couldn't control himself and ate his bread rations, all he could have done was steal from somebody else. If he was caught stealing, the guards would have killed him. And if he couldn't pay the ration that he owed to the other inmate, that guy could have stabbed him. You can't imagine what it felt like when you're so hungry and you have a piece of bread in your hands that you feel could prevent you from dying that day. It's a terrible, terrible thing. The Germans would shoot you for stealing from another prisoner, but they didn't involve themselves in our life tragedies if we killed each other. For them, we were nothing, like ashes from a cigarette that you flick away. So if my father were here, he would tell you that he did everything he could to remember every detail of what happened to him during the war when he was in the German camps in Poland and Austria, because he wanted to make sure that if he survived, he would be able to tell everybody what happened to him so nothing like this should ever happen again. Not to him, not to the Jews, and not to anybody else. For my part as his son, I would like the readers to connect with my father's initiative, his chutzpah. He and his brothers were ordinary people, regular guys who made a commitment to each other and to their core values. Time after time, they did the simple, hard thing when faced with the most extreme, dark situations. And that opened up a level of resilience and tenacity inside of themselves that they never knew existed. My father and his brothers are an example of the kind of hidden potential within all of us. Every day they would wake up with a single-minded focus to stay together for that day and to do whatever they could to survive. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott. Move on to our next author. Rebecca Kaiser Gibson. Sorry. author of the debut novel, The Promise of a Normal Life, has 2 poetry collections, Girl as Birch and Opinel. She taught creative writing at Tufts University for 23 years and has received writing fellowships from MacDowell, Vermont Studio Center, the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, and the Massachusetts Cultural Council. She lives in Marlborough, New Hampshire, where she created and runs the reading series The Loom, Poetry in Harrisville. So, Rebecca, I'm going to ask you to unmute and spotlight you and take it away.
Well, hi. Thank you, Julie. And thank you, Scott and Jai. And thank you, everybody. And I actually like all these glitches because it makes it more, I don't know, more relaxing. I have to admit, I'm giving myself permission to actually read my comments about my book since it's a debut novel and I don't have much practice doing this, so forgive me. Oh, this book, here it is, with the writing backwards, is leading me on adventure after adventure, partly because it came together in almost complete isolation and urgent inattention. I didn't articulate what I was doing or why. I didn't show it to people who might comment on the writing. The only time I did, the person I showed it to was impatient with the main character and needed her to act decisively in a way that I knew was out of character. That reader's response silenced me for quite a while. Like Scott, I put my writing in the closet, that closet right behind me, for many years. I wrote it in separate segments over decades when I was mostly focused on teaching and then on writing and publishing poetry. I wrote the pieces, printed them, stapled them individually, I'm not quite sure why, and filed them away in boxes in the closet. So now as I share the book with people, I'm discovering things that I wasn't explicitly aware of or intentionally aware of. So it's kind of an adventure into my own book. It's fun. The first person female narrator is unnamed. That wasn't always the case. Initially, I tried out several names. Once I arbitrarily thought of calling her Helen, but then I realized that people would think she was Helen of Troy or based on Helen of Troy. And she's sort of the opposite of a Helen of Troy character. She has no sense of her physical being. I assume Helen did, given her story. It's about her, it's not about her objective physical body in space. And actually, I now realize that's part of why she is now unnamed. The book is from her perspective. The world is from her eyes, as if it comes into being as she sees it. I think that's sort of like magical thinking, right? Anyway, there is little objective reality for her. And I realized that if I named her, I, the author, would be presenting her as a being with nameable boundaries. I'd be interrupting the premise of the totality of her perspective. We are now somewhat painfully in with her. We may even become too aware of what she ought to do, how she ought to extricate herself from various situations faster than she does. Of course, I didn't swoop in, I didn't pull her out, triumphantly presenting her, taking the actions that we readers might urge her to take. I realize now that I wanted to watch her, watch how intuitive each impulse is, both informed by and limited by her expectations. I wanted to experience her incremental realizations and setbacks. So part of what impelled me, or maybe allowed me to consider finally putting the pieces together and out into the world, was that several things happened sort of simultaneously. Primarily, of course, was the pandemic shutdowns that gave me time and uninterrupted quiet and the impulse to clean up my closet. And then to discover that I had all these little stapled together individual pieces of prose that I might release from their staples and put together in a new unchronological way with a consistent narrator at the center. And another part was the then recent Kavanaugh hearings here in the United States. You probably all know about those hearings in which Christine Blasey Ford came forward with accusations of sexual abuse from years before, and that she's now I think she's still a university professor and research psychologist, not, as my father would say, a shrinking violet. Her story, her silence for years pricked my attention. Then the Me Too movement added evidence to my sense that many women, many beyond those who have spoken up, had not broken their silence. And the question was, why not? This book, among other questions, rather quietly addresses itself to the forces, overt and covert, that hindered girls speaking up, even as the burgeoning women's liberation movement and feminist intellectualism of the 60s urged powerful and righteous reaction to abuse. The narrator's reticence is interesting to me. Clearly, her mother, Paulina, is self-absorbed in her larger-than-life versions of her own superiority to everyone else. But there is also the scene I'm about to read that occurs during a Seder, in which the narrator describes an experience I understand as the onset of internalized anti-Semitism. Once I articulated that to myself, I began to see the parents' overbearing performance of themselves as the mirror other side, having to prove legitimacy by intensity and display. I realize now that I wanted to show some of the complexity created by the blindly optimistic outlook of the post-World War II generation in the States. Their sense of evil having been vanquished at great cost, but now over, and how that lie has overlaid and tried to replace the haunting reality of centuries of anti-Semitism. The parents are evidence of both of these strains. The narrator intuits both the sense of difference from and the desire to be embraced by the dominant culture, as well as, especially in this scene I'm going to read, a fantasy notion of glorious, if brief, radiant nobleness. The segment I'm going to read is a flashback to an earlier time. The female narrator, whose internal voice we hear, is a young teenager at her family's catered Seder. Her mother is named Paulina, the father is Leonard, the sister is Joyce. I hope you're still with me with all these names. The two Black waiters mentioned are Edward and Alvin, and Elsie is the caterer cook. And I've taken the liberty, somewhat achronistically, of regendering the four sons in the Haggadah into girls. And I've reconfigured the context of the simple one who asks, "What is this?" and shifted the emphasis on the final one from being one with no sense of obligation, no will to serve, as possibly one who understands something without the need of explanation, the silent person. And that's the name of this chapter I'm going to read from, The Silent Person. In the ceremony, the leader of the Seder condemns the wicked child who separates herself from others, disdaining to be counted as one among them. Wickedness, though, was not exactly how I remembered it, more untouchable or shadow. I did remember a time when there was no separation, some summer when the family had been at Cape Cod and I was playing in one of those freshwater ponds we'd stop at on the way home from the beach to get the sand off. In the water, I alone rolled over and over and over like a log, over and over so that up and down disappeared. My hair followed me around in the water, drifting long and brown before my eyes as I rolled round and round, knowing that I and the shafts of light were floating specks in the same substance. But then, walking from school, my first day in a green kilt, walking up the half block from school through the brassy autumn trees, scuffing the leaves, somehow the transition occurred. I became aware that my mouth was too big, felt my arms awkward in a navy blue sweater. I had seen the other girls had sweaters with holly trees dancing on them, tiny flowers cuffs folded along some invisible line that matched the neat tops of their clean white socks. Their hair was ribboned and glistening. How, in that long, short stretch of the world between the public school and our large white house, up the pleasant curve of sidewalk with pine trees and grass, the neighbor's hump of pinkly flowered bush, the heady drone of honeybees, the white clouds and the birds, how, in that little space of territory, had a shadow come down and attached itself to my form? All my clothes and my sandwiches and my crayons and the way I would learn to sign my name in thick gray lines and the placement of my desk in all the classrooms, all were informed by this shadow. And my family around the dinner table was part of the shadow. The juicy meat in their mouths, the hot spurts of their arguments. I saw the chewed food slide to the corners of their mouth in mid-sentence. I'd seen Paulina's strange oblong clothes, her severe chapeau, her dark eyebrows. I'd smelled the perfume in Paulina's tall bottle, beheld its amber color, its austere elegance, the way the name of it in French was stretched in lean gold letters across the bottle. Was that why I chose as my first friend Deirdre, who was blonde, pale, with tidy thin lips, who wore pleasant pastels? Was that what wicked was? Leonard picked Joyce to read the third question. With the person unwilling to ask, you must begin yourself as it is written. You shall tell your child on that day, saying, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I went free from Egypt. Leonard knew that Joyce was definitely not the person unable to ask. She was all interrogation, all interruption. The silent person just shows up. My father smiled at me lovingly. Can it be that this child hears something different? It sounded like the inside of my dreams. No, it sounded like all the time. Seeing Cynthia down the table, her graceful ringed fingers resting on an empty plate in front of her, I remembered with a mild shock one night when I was very young and had stayed overnight at Cynthia and Simon's house. Cynthia had smelled to me of sweet lightness, high and light-haired, glinting of jewelry, a voice waving, rolling serenely. I'd felt the ripples as they descended to my level, flattened to undulations around me. Late that night, when Cynthia lay in a silky yellow gown on her bed, I had sleepwalked into their bedroom. I'd been striding in dream visions of butterflies, meadows, knowing only slightly that I was walking on a gray woolen rug, propped short, and there was no sun here really. The light was off. Still, undeniably, there was a butterfly with large outstretched wings just out of reach. It had led me into the room where they slept in their bed, long-legged, their marble bodies catching the moon. Suddenly, water cascaded, splashing in the grasses, marshes. A bird leapt up from a huge tree. The butterfly faded in splendor. A light was flicked on. I stood there in wet pajamas, a dark pool beneath my feet. What is this? True redemption, someone read, will come to the Jew only if he bears his name and every burden with gleaming courage and radiant nobleness. Ernest and Alvin hovered at the French doors with bottles of wine poised for the next glass to be filled. They were early. The meal is served, Leonard announced, waving a regal arm at Alvin. And then I watched them enter, tall, black, silent, with trays of Elsie's food. They dipped and swayed around the table, making quiet talk with guests. They looked like tall plants, the seated people like flowers. In came the soup, ladled by Elsie in the kitchen, her face hot over the stove, lifting the pudgy matzo balls into the shallow china bowls. Hurrying and hurrying, yet smooth in their black suits, Ernest and Alvin had arranged them onto trays, then gliding through the kitchen, the hall, into the empty living room where they stationed trays so they could bring 2 soup bowls out into the sunroom. I took a few sips out of my large silver spoon. The soup was good and hot. The steam rising into my nostrils warmed me. What if I were standing at the head of a long medieval street and people, astonished, pointed at me from upper story windows? What if I were standing at the head of the street, a stream of words screaming from my mouth unstoppably? I understood then, at least for a moment, that I'd held something, a bird's egg, in my mouth for years. Crack it, I thought. Become the sand crab, the purple starfish, the underwater bracken swirling in the white sunlight. Passing through waters amid signs and wonders, was this our people born? The service, at its crescendo, ended. Everyone ambled bumpingly into the living room. I moved close to Joyce and found myself utterly embraced, but I curled out of the hug the way it enfolded and seemed to obliterate me. Tomorrow would be an ordinary day, though the refrigerator would be full of leftover lamb carefully wrapped in waxed paper, and the apricot mousse would sag forlornly in glass containers. Leftover matzah would be scrunched back into boxes. I would be alone in my head all day. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I can tell you're a poet. Definitely. Beautiful. Okay. Let me introduce our last author. Jai Chakrabarti is the author of the novel Play for the End of the World, which won the National Jewish Book Award, was the Association of Jewish Libraries Honor Book, was shortlisted for the Tagore Prize, and was longlisted for the Penn Faulkner Award. His debut story collection, A Small Sacrifice for an Enormous Happiness, was published just a few weeks ago, so congratulations, Mazel Tov, Jai. And this is his second time appearing at Literary Modiin, by the way. His short fiction has appeared in One Story, Electric Literature, A Public Space, Conjunctions, and elsewhere, and has been anthologized in the O. Henry Prize Stories, Best American Short Stories, and awarded a Pushcart Prize. Born in Kolkata, India, he now lives in New York with his family. So let me spotlight you, Jai, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Julie. It's great to be back. And thank you, Scott, for sharing the stories of your father. Thank you, Rebecca, for that affecting, poetic reading. I was so moved. And thank you, everyone who's here in Israel and the States and wherever you may be from. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of writing this story collection. I'm going to talk a little bit about my headspace as I was writing it, as it were. And this is the book here with its very bright cover for the winter days. And I was writing some of these stories as I was doing research for my novel. So my novel, which came out in 2021, is a work of historical fiction. So there's a correspondence that begins with a play that was written by Rabindranath Tagore. Thank you, Rebecca, for holding up the novel. That begins with a play from Rabindranath Tagore that was performed in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942. And I was doing a lot of research about Poland, India. And so during that time, I was at some points, I was living in Israel. I was in Poland, I was in India doing research. I was in New York, in the archives there, because the novel spanned all of those places, except Israel, actually. We were just living there for other reasons. And there was a lot happening in my personal life during this time that I was kind of devoted to this historical novel and became enmeshed in the world of Janusz Korczak and the story around him. And to talk a little bit briefly about what some of those things, it was really about growing deeper into love. So I'm married to the poet Ilana Bell. And so she and I, we were trying to conceive a child. Like many couples, we struggled to conceive for many years, went through lots of challenging experiences and miscarriages and all that. And then we finally, miraculously, it feels to me now, had a child. And so that experience was very different than how we predicted it. The title of this book is called A Small Sacrifice for an Enormous Happiness. And it's from the title story where two gay men in India are thinking about having a child. And one of them says, and I'm paraphrasing, that, let's go ahead and do this. This is going to be a small sacrifice for an enormous happiness. And as someone who is now a parent to a 7-year-old, I can tell you that it's more than a small sacrifice, and sometimes the happiness is questionable. I think perhaps all parents can relate to that. So these stories were really about my way of exploring these questions of yearning for a child, of feeling at times that I was living between countries. So I was born in Kolkata, India, as Julie mentioned. I've spent time, of course, in the States, but also through love and marriage and Jewish communities. And so I was trying to find how I could talk about straddling cultures and what it meant for me as someone who has straddled cultures for so much of my life, like what that experience is. And some of the influences for this collection are, of course, Bengali writers writing in Bengali, right, like Rabindranath or Ashapurna Devi, but also Jewish writers like Ida Fink, the Polish Jewish writer, but also Bashevis Singer, as well as Bernard Malamud, who was a pretty significant influence for me. And with somebody like Malamud, you have these incredibly high stakes, you have spiritual or yearning. I think The Magic Barrel is one of these extraordinary books of fiction that I recommend over and over again. And what I love about the short story format is that it's kind of a technology for us to see characters behaving badly. In real life, we don't want our loved ones to make bad choices, but in short stories, take the stories of Malamud, for example, it's an opportunity for characters to make mistakes. And by reading about them, we can learn something about who they are and how they fall into love, and perhaps avoid some of those mistakes ourselves. So it's a beautiful format that I've always loved. And there's a definition of literary fiction that I really appreciate, which is that literary fiction is fiction that speaks to other work. And so when Rebecca was reading, I could hear so many influences. I could hear Virginia Woolf, for example, in some of those passages. And so she read a section about a catered Seder. So I wasn't sure what I was going to read today, but I think I'm going to read a story that is really framed or what is actually a catered Seder. And the story is called Searching for Elijah. And just to introduce the story a little bit, and then I'll just read a couple of pages. So it's about a woman, Malini, an Indian woman who has fallen in love with a Jewish man. She's visiting him and his family for the first time in their LA home. And they are having the Seder dinner together. And she has a young son. And so she is kind of encountering these questions of meeting another family, meeting your future in-laws for the first time, and she's encountering questions of what it means to preserve her identity, but also come into another family. So I'll just read a couple of pages here from Searching for Elijah. Malini and her son were the last to arrive at the Passover dinner. Mrs. Cohen greeted them at the door, engulfing Malini in her silk decolette kaftan, and hurried them to the table. Now that we're all here, Mrs. Cohen said, shall we wash? The family mumbled a collective yes. Around the table, there were 4 cousins, 3 neighbors, Stephen, his older sister, Elizabeth, and Mr. Cohen. Everyone smiled back at Malini, hiding what she assumed were varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity. Amar, who was waking from a cross-country sleep, buried his face in her lap. "We wash before the meal," Stephen whispered. I know. Malini had researched the Passover Seder via an audio guide that described the order and meaning of the ceremony. When riding the subway, she would wear headphones and mouth the Hebrew words as they were said, Kiddush, Magid, Maror. But now that she was here, it did not seem so simple, not with all the family watching and her son wondering what came next. "We do it a little differently," Stephen said. "We wash each other's hands." Her little boy tried to hide behind her legs, and she had to coax him into the kitchen, where Mr. Cohen, who Stephen had explained excelled at entertaining kids Amar's age and pined for a grandchild himself, lifted him onto the countertop and washed his hands first. Amar smarted at the feel of the cold water, but Stephen's dad was ready with a magic trick that ended with 2 red jelly beans. Amar laughed and splashed water. "You, be calm." Before they'd left New York, Malini had Amar promise that he would be on his best behavior. "If you do," she'd said, "there'll be a new toy for you." "Your turn," Mrs. Cohen said. Malini presented her hands, a queen's hands, the color of molasses, fingers slender and long. Both hands were adorned. A sapphire ring crowned each one. "They're beautiful," Mrs. Cohen said. She'd bought the years 3 years earlier, after her husband had passed away. The astrologer had told her the gems were for love and persistence. Mrs. Cohen poured water on Malini's palms, 3 times on the left, 3 times on the right. She wrapped Malini's hands in a towel and dried them. It felt like an unearned intimacy, but Malini maintained her smile. Mrs. Cohen leaned close to whisper, "I bless you for tomorrow's mikveh, that you may be purified, that you may be holy." Malini recoiled from Mrs. Cohen's grasp. Tomorrow's mikveh, the purification ritual, had been on her mind ever since she and Stephen had become serious. She cut her eyes at Amar, who was splashing water again, but this time it was a welcome distraction from Mrs. Cohen's gaze. "Thank you for the blessing," Malini said. Then she went to tend to her son. Malini and Stephen had met at the farmer's market. In between nanny shifts, Malini worked a food stall called Brooklyn Masala Company, where she sold her simmering sauces and chutneys. She was there every weekend, and the other stall owners knew her, so there was never a shortage of eyes on Amar. Her boy could wander through the market and be safe while she sold her cooking and chatted with her customers, though she could always feel when he ventured too far, when she'd call him back with her stern voice. It was the tikka masala sauce, the simmer of coconut and cardamom-infused tomato, that Stephen came back for again and again. But it was only on his 6th time, he later told her, that he'd had the courage to speak. "Your sauce," he had said, "it's out of this world." She'd smiled as she did at all such compliments. It was not so difficult to see when men became smitten with her, and on that September Sunday, she knew Stephen was more than curious. What she sensed of him was that he was simple in his emotions, in his knowledge of love and loss, but that he was honest about his ignorance. He would be willing to alter his life to fit one more, maybe even 2, and if she had told him then, "Go fetch me the moon," he would have borrowed a ladder and tried his best. And I will just pause there. Thank you.
Great. That was great. Thank you. Okay. Once again, I see that Zoom says we're going to be kicked out soon. So please start putting your questions in the chat. I'm going to add spotlights for our other authors. And allow you guys, wait, you can unmute. Okay. Anyone have any questions? In the meantime, I'll tell you that you should check out the Literary Modiin page because our April event and our May event are scheduled. So but I don't want to waste that. Okay. Any questions? Anybody? Okay. Wait. Yes. Yeah, wonderful readings, everyone. Yes, I agree. Wonderful readings, everyone. I have a quick question for Jai. You were talking about the process of writing. So were you writing the short stories at the same time that you were writing the novel, or did you sometimes take a break from your novel, or cheat on your novel by writing a story, or how did that work?
Yeah, I was writing at the same time, because I think writing a novel, I don't know, Rebecca, how you felt about it, but I felt like it was a little bit like being stranded on a desert island with very little food and water. And, if there were opportunities for me to leave the desert island at times, I would take that. And so there were moments where I just didn't know where to go next in the novel. And I had something that I wanted to explore. So the short story format was a really good way to explore it.
Okay, I see a lot of accolades in the chat from people reading your books. That's great. Any questions you want to ask each other? Before I get kicked out.
Well, I can say something about. I had sort of the opposite experience because I didn't even notice that I was writing a novel. So the whole thing was an escape from the. I mean, I was. Anyway, I didn't notice until I actually did it, and I put it together really fast. So I don't think that will ever happen to me again, but it was fun.
Right now,
My
you
question
never
for you,
know.
Rebecca. Oh, yeah, I have a question for you, which is, what was it like for you transitioning from being a poet? I guess it's not really transitioning, but being a poet to writing a novel.
Well, again, I wasn't conscious that I was writing a novel. I was writing these things. In fact, that's probably why I didn't show it to anybody, because it didn't count. I felt like only poetry counted, because the novel, it was sort of moving along in such a, I mean, the prose seemed to have its own, like a current in a river. It just sort of went, whereas poetry was more putting things together, and I was more conscious, I think, of what I was doing than I was doing that. So I'm quite mystified about what's going to happen next. I don't, poetry or prose, if there's some difference, other than the fact that it does seem like people seem to read prose more than they read poetry, which is kind of fun.
I have a question for Scott. Now that you've written one book, or would you like to? Do you think you're going to continue writing other things as well?
I really don't know. I never aspired to be a writer. This project has been chasing me my entire adult life, and when I hit my mid-50s, I finally got so fat and slow that it finally caught me. What I am doing is I've adapted one of the stories from this book into a children's book that I'm trying to work on and get published. So we'll see how that goes. And in the meantime, I'm sort of taking a break and trying to make a living doing regular work.
I have something to add to what I just said. This is a secret, everybody. I do have a bunch of things that may be stories from my time in India. And I don't know, I'm really intrigued. I was really intrigued by what you were saying about what the short story can do, Jai. So thank you.
Yeah, maybe those are
We'll
short
see.
stories. Yeah.
So someone just made a comment, Rebecca, I liked your what if while going about ordinary everyday activities. Maybe that could be part of your next book. Okay. Kind of lost the little thing on the Zoom that was telling me how much time we have left.
It says less than a minute.
Less than a minute. Okay. So